going to get started. Welcome, everyone. My name is Daniela Bleichmer. I am a professor of art history and history at USC and the director of the Levin Institute for the Humanities. We do ask everyone who is here if they are able to turn on their camera. It's much nicer to see faces than names or still photos, so please turn on your camera if you are able to. And thank you so much for joining us for this book chat, where we will be discussing Karen Tongson's new book, Normporn, Queer Viewers, and the TV That Soothes Us from NYU Press 2023. Joining Karen in the conversation about her book are Scott Poulson-Bryant, who is assistant professor of Afro-American and African Studies at the University of Michigan, and Sarah Gertrude Shapiro, who is a co-creator, writer, and supervising producer of Lifetime's hit drama series Unreal. The conversation will be moderated by Tara McPherson, who is our colleague at USC, the HMH Foundation Endowed Chair for the Study of Censorship in Media and Professor of Cinema and Media Studies at USC, and the director of the Sidney Harman Academy for Polymathic Studies. The author, Karen Tongson, well known to many of us here, is professor of gender and sexuality studies, English and American studies and ethnicities at USC. And today's book chat is a collaboration with the USC Division of Cinema and Media Studies and the USC Department of English. We'll be together till 1. The proceedings are very simple. We will start with Karen talking to us about the new book for about 5 minutes, followed by conversation between Karen and the two invited interlocutors. And then we will have around 15, maybe up to 20 minutes for questions from anyone present, moderated by Tara. So thank you again for joining us. Karen, many congratulations on the book, and please tell us about it.
Thank you so much, Daniela. It's a real honor to be doing this for the Levin Institute, and of course to everyone who works at the Levin, especially Zachary Mann for handling all of these details. It's been a pleasure to be working with Zachary as well in multiple scenarios so far this year. So I'll just start from the very first sort of question you may have in your mind if you haven't read Normporn yet. And that is, what does the word normporn mean, and where did that concept come from? And my answer to this question is always that there are two very distinct meanings for it. The first is really specific, and that attends to the specific genre or subgenre of television that I went through the trouble of identifying and thinking about for a number of years. And that's a subgenre of hour-length dramedies that are sentimental and realist in style and tone, and that have been featured on network television since at least 1987 with the series 30-something. But more generally, and this is the, I think, important part that I hope is #relatable for anybody who reads it, is that Normporn points to our lurid and almost shameful fascination with the norms and norminess that's featured on these shows, especially for viewers like queer viewers, thought to exist outside of the mainstreams depicted by these programs. And so some examples of the series that I cover in the book are, of course, 30-something as the kind of urtext. And what we're looking mostly at, though, is television from the kind of the Obama era, or like the sort of 2000s, that really kind of consolidated this sense of the new normal, or the kind of changing American family. So Parenthood was the text that inspired the book, and Gilmore Girls is another. And we also, This Is Us, of course, is the text that I call the end of Normporn, with the series True Blood as the essentially what I call the funhouse mirror to these new normie worlds populated by large, expansive liberal families, often in coastal elite places, really kind of giving us a glimpse at everyday life and the kind of problems and peccadillos that attend to that everyday life, but that in their own ways create a certain kind of seamlessness. So that's sort of what norm porn is as a genre and as a viewing practice. It's what we watch to soothe and comfort us against our better aesthetic and political judgment. And so even though some of us like to believe we're above some of these mainstream styles and sentiments, we can't help but surrender, usually through shedding tears, to the very basic feelings, desires, and worlds of privilege that that these shows present to us. So that's sort of the overall concept of norm porn. And the way that it unfolds is really through these case studies and a look at the kind of historical, popular and historical political histories that attend to and frame these shows and their emergence. So yes, we get the Obama era, but we think about Biden vis-a-vis Parenthood and him as Zeke Braverman in the introduction. We also think a lot about like what it meant for, say, the Trump era to intercede in this book that I actually started writing around thinking about and writing around 2015, and had to rewrite completely once we were derailed from the political trajectory of new normalcy, or what people would call a certain kind of neoliberal normalcy from that period onwards. And I guess, I only have another minute or so left, and I'm really eager to get into the conversational part of this. So I'm just going to mention what inspired the writing of this book and why, I decided to fixate on these particular shows. And so I mentioned that it was in around 2014 or 15 that I began thinking about these shows, particularly through Parenthood. And I went through in 2013 and 2014 a particularly awful period of losing a number of loved ones, including 5 close friends and family members in a single year. And that meant I watched a lot of television. So when I binged Parenthood, which I'd started watching when it was airing on network, I found myself sobbing even more uncontrollably at scenes and situations that seemed totally corny and mundane, and that reinforced certain cringy norms about what family and intimacy mean. And up to that point in my life as a queer person, I thought I existed on a different emotional plane, a more expansive political universe of political and social possibilities, really. But here I was crying against my will and better judgment. So at the stuff that my entire career as a queer studies theorist has been devoted to critiquing. So I had to really think about what that disidentificatory moment was, what the push and pull, the contradictions of that were about. And so that's what I did, and that's how norm porn came to be, is diving into that twisted sense of desire, repulsion, and the thrills that inevitably turned into a sense of self-loathing, but also was like amplified by a lot of desire, right? So then hence the porn part of norm porn. So and as I already said, the election of Donald Trump the first time in 2016 made me reevaluate this project and reframe the project historically, to think, because I just thought things would kind of continue on as they were going in the Obama era, but obviously they did not. So I'm going to stop there. I think that I've occupied my 5 minutes of time, and I'm just excited to welcome Scott and Sarah into the conversation. Oh, I think Scott's muted.
I was just chastising you for being muted earlier. Yeah, you actually, thank you for having me. First of all, you and I have been talking about TV forever, so it's sort of lovely to hold this wonderful book in my hand. You actually sort of got at the question I was going to ask you, but I was hoping you could say more. why these shows, these 4 shows? Is there, and I actually was wondering, are there shows that didn't make the cut, like didn't make the short book cut, right? But how did you come to gathering these 4 shows in particular together? If there's a reason sort of beyond you having rediscovering parenthood, which I love that story and the sort of intimacy you give us at the beginning of the book by telling that story. But yeah, I was just curious about that.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, like if I wanted to make this a comprehensive book, like tracing the whole genealogy of Normporn, I would have to dive into a lot of other texts. Everybody always asks about brothers and sisters, for example, is another one that kind of fits the bill, although I do think it's a little more melodramatic. You know, part of it was that there was a political through line that was transformed in each of these shows that I selected by 2016, right? So I think, you know, whether or not it was Gilmore Girls post Roe v. Wade, thinking about This Is Us after the Black Lives Matter George Floyd protests of 2020, like basically history sort of determined like where it was headed. There were also queer shows, norm-porny, explicitly queer shows that I thought about including, and in the first draft in my mind, were definitely there, like The Fosters. And even I was toying with Transparent, even though I don't think Transparent fits the bill because it definitely tries to do something a little more new queer cinema oriented or a little more artistic than this kind of middlebrow realist sentimentality, although there's plenty of that there. So yeah, so I think that part of it was that like I was able to cull after sitting in the political milieu of what happened after, you know, I started working on this book and like sitting on it a little bit and thinking a little more. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Hi.
Hey,
well, I just loved every minute of reading this book. I have to say, like after page 3, I think I texted you and said your brain is a national treasure, which is something I've always felt about you, but it's such a joy to like eat it on the page. I just could have done it. Yeah, I love it. I think one thing that really resonated with me in terms of having, you know, I am a television writer. I work in writers' rooms. I've created my own television shows. And so sort of dissecting the DNA of how some of these shows came to be, and specifically with Parenthood, you had a great way of speaking about Ed Zwick. I was going to just read one part of, it was a quote from, I think, the ATX reunion that the creators of Parenthood were at.
Oh, 30-something.
What's that? Oh, 30-something.
30-something, yeah.
30-something, yeah, that's what I meant.
Yeah,
Sorry.
yeah.
As Zwick elaborated, the room full of executives who greenlit the project coincidentally had the same issues, the same context that we did about our lives. And we did not pitch it in any conventional way. In fact, we just talked about what was happening in our lives, and it mirrored what was happening in their lives. And then your comment is, oh, the structural advantage of coincidence, or how relatability works in Hollywood, which I just love. I love that passage so much. Because one of the things that I've found so much in writers' rooms is that there's such an assumption of wealth in those circles. And it is so kind of frowned upon to bring economic reality into those rooms. And it's something that I've encountered over and over again when I pitch storylines or shows where the story driver is really about economic reality or struggle. There's a sense that things, even when they're striving towards realism, need to be aspirational. And I think the whole thing is so limited by the people who have access to being in the industry. And so I sort of wondered if you had thought about like counterpoints to this level of privilege. Are there any shows that you feel like define the alternative to this in terms of economic reality?
Well, I do think that historically the sitcom format is actually the one that gives us, you know, a peek into working class lives, or even rural lives that are transformed from moving to the country to the city, or what have you, whether or not it's all the way back to the honeymooners, to, you know, to Roseanne, to even a show like Superstore, more recently, a sitcom that I
Yeah,
love.
yeah,
Yeah, that brings in union politics,
yeah.
working in a big box superstore. So I think that as a format, honestly, like, and with its focus on the workplace and sometimes the home in different ways, the sitcom format has really achieved a lot in terms of opening up that class discourse and dialogue. The problem with the primetime drama like format is that even when they depict, or typically the container for hard scrabble working class like situations is also couched in like propaganda, like cop shows,
100%.
or SVU, or or firefighting, or all of these different like these are the true working people. It's either that, especially in the 80s when we start talking about when 30 something emerged as this kind of unique sort of glimpse at yuppie life, which was just sort of cohering as a taste culture and a class, right? That, you know, you had Dynasty Dallas, like extreme opulent Reagan era wealth, and then you had,
Like Hill Street Blues.
Hill Street Blues, and then
Yeah,
other and you had a lot of
yeah.
the quote unquote grittier, but often like crime related shows. So that's where I would the counterexample certainly of something like Normporn are, but prestige television, I think, or
Almost
what
assumes privilege. Yeah.
exactly, or FOTI. Yeah, it's like it wants to tap into the people who are the characters in 30 something who would otherwise eschew watching television, right?
Mhm.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And I also wondered, sort of on that same line, how Happy Days and shows like that sort of fit into the genealogy of this kind of TV, in terms of reinforcing sort of propaganda around what the American family should be. I always find that such a fascinating example of creating a show about the 50s and the 70s in terms of trying to remind us that we all still like each other. You know, it's sort of that propaganda around keeping the family together when it was apparently coming apart.
Yeah, and domesticating the
Yeah.
Fonz,
Yeah.
domesticating a quote unquote greaser
Yeah.
white working class
Yeah.
dude, who's like, "Ooh," like turning that into a sweet, cuddly character as opposed to a countercultural threat to like, the
Yeah.
folks in Happy Days. Same with like, also I love Laverne and Shirley, right? They're working
Yeah.
class girls who work at a brewery in Milwaukee. And then
Yeah.
they end up moving to California, and like other shit happens. Sorry. you know, yeah, yeah. Anyway, yeah, thanks for asking those questions though, because people always, because it is such a narrow category that I'm talking about. Norm porn,
Yeah.
what's narrow, but I think also encompassing.
Yeah, no, I think that the thing around prestige television really feels relevant to me too in that context. And I think the thing with in Parenthood too, with the boomer, sort of the economic ghost of the boomers' reality around having that house in Berkeley. Like, I feel like that house is such a ghost of an economic past in terms
Yeah.
of, you know, sort of I very like job ambiguous patriarch who was able to afford to have 4 children and some artsy wife, and then sort of has this huge craftsman home, you know. And I think that those sort of things are fantasies in a lot of ways. And I find that from having been in the industry and in writers' rooms, so many of us come from money. And I would even consider myself at the lower end of that spectrum, that I find being in those rooms, there's something very prohibited about really pitching economic reality. So,
Yeah.
Karen, sort of to Sarah's question, one of the things that I was thinking about as I read was sort of a formal question, like that the book is pretty much invested in the sort of subgenre of the dramedy. One of those words that I've always hated as much as I've loved the actual shows that they name. And I was wondering if, and this might be completely off target, I don't know, but I was curious about the sort of formal aspects of norm porn, right? Like, and whether we find norm porn in a sitcom, right? If there's does say Modern Family fit the norm? You know what I mean? Like in the ways in which it's sort of grappling with, right, normativity and the sort of extended family and all that, the things that you cite in the book. And I was just curious if prestige TV and the sort of dramedy that sort of gave birth to all that, is that totally central for you to the idea of norm porn in the television space, at least?
I think so, because of the way 30 something was heralded as not TV when it, came out, right? So it was sort of like, oh, this is something that exceeds the boundaries, the paltry boundaries of television, because of its mumbly realist, and then sort of like with occasional flights of fantasy, but the combination of drama and comedy, and also like the focus on truly like small domestic issues. I always, bring this up as an example. It's like episode 2, I think the episode description for episode 2 of 30 something is Hope is stressed out because the bathroom remodel isn't done before her in-laws arrive. And it's sort of like, and that's a whole episode, right? And like that kind of, and the angst from that though is something that amplifies what seems like a small problem into something much bigger and grander. And so the way 30 something achieved that and exceeded at the time, now it's like everything, a lot of things look like 30 something, right? But in the late 1980s, everybody was like, this is art, right? Which the TV scholars of that period also reflected on, folks like Sasha Torres, et cetera. But I do think, to your point, absolutely, Modern Family is like one of the examples that people always bring to me. And, and part of what I say is that, there's like too much slapstick in it in the long run, right? Yeah, there is something about like each episode having its kind of resolution. And the structure is still very much, sitcom-y, even if it can make you cry and make you laugh and do all of those things. That said, I want to underscore for everyone that even though I take the time to describe this subgenre at length in the book, I am as interested in or as invested in the viewing practice of watching norm porn. Like different people have different things that they watch to soothe in various ways. Sometimes that's like nonstop episodes, also aspirational, of House Hunters International. Sometimes it's what I've said in a footnote in the book was civic norm porn, like the kind of a functioning and soaring liberal governmentality that everybody misses, like the West Wing or Madam Secretary, right? Or, like the kind of corrective that's posed by that. But yeah, I think that there is something about that. And, and I know this is going to be like cinematically, I mean, one thing that struck me when I watched Zone of Interest, for example, Oscar-nominated winning film, is that part of what's happening in that film is underscoring in the household, in the field of domesticity, all of this kind of grotesque, like a grotesque version of norm porn stuff happening. Oh no, will my mother like the house? What about the garden? Et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But the literal backdrop is one that, is horrific, genocidal, etc. And there is something to be said about how norm porn in these, especially in the political context I've been talking about as TV, right, can be those, those moments where, Hope and Michael are worried about the bathroom remodel, but there's a lot of stuff happening in 1989, for example, in the world, globally and politically, that, bears notice as well, right? So it's sort of what is the balance between that hyperfixation on domesticity and the soothing aspects of that versus, what we avert our eyes and ears from.
I couldn't help thinking about the TV show Family. Do you remember that show with Sarah?
Oh yeah, yeah.
Sarah Thompson, I believe, and Meredith Baxter Burney and Christy McNichol, an early queer icon of mine growing up. I couldn't help thinking about that as even a precursor to what 30-something was doing.
Yes.
And there was a kind of elegance to it that you didn't really find in a lot of 70s TV, but this attention paid to the sort of daily, sort of quotidian, the minutia moments of life in terms of building familial relationships. So maybe because I'm older than you, I found myself thinking even pre 30-something, right?
Yeah.
You were in high school, I think. I was in college by the time 30-something came out, and 30-something became for me, and for the significant amount of young Black folks I was watching it with. Like, I remember very distinctly, oddly, having this conversation with some friends that we actually didn't think of 30-something as a white show. Like, there was something in it. I don't know if it was the aspirational thing that we were all about to graduate from college and go into the world. But I'm a person who oftentimes watches TV shows and thinks that's a white show versus that's a show. And some of that oftentimes is about the white pathos that you referred to later in the book, and writing about This Is Us. And I couldn't not think about like my racial position watching and loving a lot of these exact shows you're writing about, and how that distinguishing between like TV show and white TV show with very white characters is something that I find now will sort of always relate to norm porn because of reading your theorizing in this book.
Well, first of all, yes, I thought about family. Adam Rich was on that show too, right?
Adam Ritt, yep.
With his like I want to say the
he
platonic ideal of the bowl
he
cut.
guest starred
in
on the show.
1970.
He was a regular on Eight Is Enough, but he guest starred, I believe, on Family. Yeah,
Yeah, yeah. I mean, and Eight Is Enough also had a little
Eight Is
bit of
Enough
that
sort of thing,
vibe as
right?
well, right? So like there were those things. The thing about I want to say about 1970s television and why like I think the 80s really kind of changed things a little bit is that 70s was defined by, you know, social issues television, by Norman Lear, by people
Right, true. Right,
actually willing to
right.
uh, dive into these topics in a substantial way, to say the word abortion on Maude, to talk about rape on All in the Family, to talk about the things that, otherwise would be sort of papered over, absorbed in a televisual universe. The 70s did something to disrupt that. And there's something about the 80s and the arrival of 30-something where it brings all of that quotidian realism, but then maybe just like stays just within that world without gesturing towards anything bigger until we get to the AIDS crisis, honestly, in 30-something. Yeah.
I feel like you did such a beautiful job of articulating sort of the practice of norm porn and what the catharsis the catharsis for each person engaging with the material was. And I do think that it's interesting, that people have different viewing habits, and I think people do have different ways of finding that release. And for me, what was so poignant about what you were talking about is the longing, I think, for cohesion and family. But then also just the willingness to be manipulated, to be like truly manipulated to the point of release. And that felt very specific in terms of defining the genre. And I feel like other people I know talk about the Great British Bake Off. I mean, I think kind of everyone I know has their kink around like what soothes them when they're really like their anxiety is out of control. For me, it's masterpiece theater, which is totally perverse. But like but I thought you did such a good job of articulating the need for it, like what it does for you emotionally and what it does for us emotionally as a country, and then also sort of the larger propaganda aspect of it, in sort of how we consume it and what it does to our idea of ourselves too.
One of my favorite sentences in the book, Karen, is my norm porn may not be your norm porn.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah, I think that has to be acknowledged, right? Because I think that I'll say that one of the early readers' reports I had for the project is just sort of, well, what distinguishes these, like what other than cherry picking certain shows, like what's the sort of rationale for these particular shows? The question that you began with, Scott. And honestly, like I think the point precisely is the kind of cherry picking and then understanding what historically connects them, right? What production history was as well. Production, like from 30 something to This Is Us, you have this very similar personnel kind of flooding in and out or between these different shows. So that's the rationale for my selection of Normporn. But in the end, I think that like, I love the idea of Normporn's portability. I wish Sarah, that I thought of the phrase manipulating to the point of release, because that does just like.
I think you did. I thought it was in there.
I think it's like it hits the porn
Yeah.
part very well of Normporn, right? Because people are like, well, is this really about porn? And you know, in many respects, yeah. And I think that there is also like tremendous guilt and shame and like resentment at being, you know,
Tear jerked.
yeah, tear jerked, exactly. Like, you know, held in those particular ways, right? So one other show that I thought about including, that I really wanted to include when I first thought about this project was the US remake of the Australian series, The Slap. I don't know how many
Oh,
of you
yeah.
watched that, because
Oh,
that
God.
honestly is like, for sure, that's exactly one of those scenarios or situations where it's all like small, a little bit tiny, small and tiny problems and what have you. So, you know,
I also thought you had a great quote around Gen Z sort of religiously rewatching Gilmore Girls and Friends, and sort of what that does for them catharsis wise, which I'd love to hear you talk about more, because for me it's this sort of, to me it appears to be this longing for the before times. Like it appears to be a longing for something that I don't think ever really existed. But I also think how it interplays with white supremacy sort of existing on TV unquestioned is like very interesting, especially because I think the person you had talking about it was a person of color who was talking about engaging with Gilmore Girls specifically.
I think that person might even be in this Zoom.
Oh, yeah.
But yeah, but also well, it's like pre 9/11.
The I feel like that was another big piece for me, which I feel like was sprinkled in there, but I definitely feel like it's a pre 9/11, post 9/11 question too.
Yeah, I think that I would probably, you know, for sake of simplicity, say that that's where I think that the nostalgia heads. It's also like pre 9/11, and also just like pre accountability. I'm not going to use the phrase political correctness, but like before there was like kind of a larger sense, and a more amplified sense, in part because of social media platforms, et cetera, around accountability for saying stuff,
and also casting in ways that was
casting and what have you, right? Like and sustaining certain fantasies about what, you know, life looked like in New York City. I mean, the Living Single, Friends, like the fact that those two shows existed at the same time on network television, right? And the fact that there was like, what we got was, you know, like what we have instantiated in those two different shows is like the way the US was segregated, right? Or like the television landscape was segregated. I think it's really kind of important to note. I also will say though that Living Single is a show that a lot of young folks have rediscovered and are really, you know, because when I teach the pop culture, it's been a minute since I've taught the US pop culture class for American Studies here at USC. And but every time I teach Living Single alongside Friends, they're like, oh, okay, like, and they kind of get what's going on there a little bit more. Yeah, and with Gilmore Girls, it's fascinating, you know, like I love that show so much, right? I know that there are many people who can't deal with like its pacing, the writing, the Sherman Palladino of it all, you know, but yeah.
it's pretty.
Yeah, anyway.
Karen, when you talk about Living Single, it makes me think about how there was that kind of that moment in the 90s, especially into the turn of the century, where there was a significant amount of Black led and Black cast shows on network TV. We can talk about sort of how they ended up, and you know, but it's interesting to think about how there were no dramedies about people of color, right? Like all those shows had their one person of color, I think of Lisa Nicole Carson on Ally McBeal, or, the guy ultimately the guy in This Is Us, which actually sort of upends a lot of the thinking about the sort of solo Negro, as I used to call it, in a lot of those shows. And so I just think about like being a queer person of color watching those shows and realizing that one of the things that made it kind of horny for me, or sort of the desire to allow myself to be manipulated and go back to it and go back to it and go back to it, was sort of structural stuff, like formal stuff, like the writing, right? Like, because I knew I wasn't ever going to be able to turn the channel and find a show full of Black people that had the sort of level of dialogue or the sort of investment in a kind of cleverness, or sort of thinking about something outside the 23-minute sitcom format. I think there are ways in which, personally, these shows became, it wasn't about being queer and Black and having shame or guilt about them, but sort of mapping my own desire onto them, right? And taking all the good stuff from them and using that as getting pleasure from that, if that makes sense.
That's the theoretical beauty of the concept disidentification, right?
I'm going to say disidentify, actually, right? That good subject, bad subject thing, right?
Exactly. It's often, yeah, but it's often, disidentification takes harm, like often what is quote harmful representation or what have you.
Right.
And there's, but I would also say the thing about that is that it's in the long tradition of queer spectatorship and queer aesthetic sensibility, is to insinuate ourselves into the scenes and storylines and melodies and what have you of things where we are excluded and absented. And for people of color, it's very much the same thing. It's it's about how we understand the nuance of a Cole Porter tune or what have you, right? It's like it's about like the reading ourselves into when we are not provided with the text as the kind of primary like vector or representation of ourselves. And so for many people, for queer folks, post-colonial folks, people of color, etc., that is the primary way of engaging culture that was created, and that has been created with a very kind of, as Sarah was just even alluding to, whether or not it's a monocultural class sensibility, certainly monocultural racialized sensibilities in the different systems that, basically buttress the culture industry, right? So yeah.
It's one of the reasons, real quick, it's one of the reasons why Alan Ball's statement that you report in the book about True Blood, don't rush to make True Blood as a metaphor for queerness. That's not what's happening. That's lazy. It's bullshit. Like that, like you would think someone like Alan, I mean, I don't know if that was a sort of corporate choice he made to allow that to be his message, but True Blood only works in very many ways by thinking about it as from the metaphorical position, its relationship to sort of queerness, like the whole language of coming out of the closet, the whole, all of that, right? So for him to have been so sort of adamant about that not being the case struck me as a little bit disingenuous, but I'm glad it was in the book because I actually didn't know that about him or his reaction to that critique.
Yeah, it's surprising, but I think that it's very much like the kind of, let's say, the American fiction discourse, right? Like if we think about it in that way, right? It's like, don't limit us to these particular stories or whatever. And I think, but I do think that like it's not limiting. I think that we need to reframe our understanding of what it means to be hailed by, say, some of the stereotypical images or what have you that like, kind of exist as the only thing that we can clutch onto or latch onto, right? Before we end up remaking. That's also what all of fan culture is about, that too, in many respects, right?
Good point, right?
So anyway, I know that we're Tara.
open this up to questions from the audience for the last 15 minutes or so of our session. But while the audience collects their thoughts, I thought I'd ask you one quick question to kind of give them some time.
Sure.
It really maps back to how you started us at the beginning in your 5 minutes, right? But I'd love for you to talk more about how this book, but your earlier work as well, really grapples with the relationship of the personal and personal affect, here bereavement and grief, to the popular. And, it's still not formulation that many academics are comfortable with, yet it adds a really powerful depth and resonance to your work. Can you speak a little bit about why you continue to hold the personal in relation to your analytical work and how that broadens out into the kind of public knowledge work that you do so well also?
That's a very generous question, a way of framing how I do things, Tara. Thank you for that. One of the things that I would say is that, and I think I say this in the book, and I say this, I think, in every book that I've written, either in the prologue or the epilogue or what have you, is that, it's not that we, like, scholars don't come into academia saying, I am going to do things that do not interest or excite or touch me or have some sort of affective resonance with me, period. Whether or not that's working on something that's completely outside or beyond one's realm of experience, right? In another hundreds of years ago, or in another epoch, or in another global site or what have you. So I think that the great mistake we make is that assuming that not everything that is produced in academia is infused with that level of interest. And like the great 19th century prose specialists of the Victorian era also pointed this out to us. I'm not a new person saying this. Even Matthew Arnold said this, even Walter Pater said this, and I we'll bring those guys up all the time. And certainly we know Oscar Wilde had a sense of this as well, right? It's that our best criticism is often filtered through our subjectivities, right? So as critics, as scholars, as thinkers, I think that it behooves us to acknowledge that this is the case rather than to assume that it's not, and to speak with it with honesty, openness, suppleness, and instead of spending all of our time, repressing that information.
Thank you so much. Hannah.
Hi, Hannah.
Hi, Karen. How's it going?
Great.
I'm really taken by Sarah's line of questioning about class and aspiration. And I'm thinking about, I saw Gia Tolentino give a talk maybe a month ago about what she was arguing was sort of the disappearance of the working class from mainstream television, and its sort of replacement by shows that are simultaneously fascinated with and deeply critical of the super rich. And I started thinking about say, your Succession and White Lotus versus your Roseanne and Laverne and Shirley, and the sort of claim that one has swapped out for the other, and what that seems to miss in terms of who the viewerships are for these different genres of TV. And so I'm curious to hear a little bit more about what we know about who watches what, and maybe even at a meta methodological question, how hard it is as a media theorist right now to know who's watching what. Can we actually get that data? Is that based on numbers we can access?
I do know that one of the bits of data that Sarah Gertrude Shapiro shared with me about who watched The Bachelor, for example, are very affluent, very highly educated, women, right? I think I don't want to misrepresent, but so that data is there. I think that one among the more interesting things, the more forgivable things the New York Times has done in recent memory is this, where you could search by your zip code what people watch.
Ooh,
there's a search tool. Yeah, there's a search. So and also like what in, like, so I of course looked up, what the working class neighborhood I grew up in Riverside watches versus the one that I live in now, which used to be a brown and working class neighborhood, right? And like, and I think that one of the things that comes to the fore is that reality, right, can cut across multiple audiences, right, in different ways, but that does seem to be the kind of greater bastion of working class viewing at this point. Deadliest Catch, I think, is like among the most popular, or this was for 5 years ago when I last checked, right?
Is that about fish?
Oh yeah, it's about like being fishermen, and like how dangerous it is. Like, so all the shows about jobs are now on reality, right? So like the fictionalization of this has been overtaken by like reality and not realism on television. So I think that, like, so anyway, that's one place where we can look and access and find out about these demographics. And you have to approach and talk to creators and ask about like the numbers that they get, right?
Yeah. I would also say that I don't think it's a coincidence that like the middle class is gone, and so now we watch shows about the super rich. It's like not fun or escapist to watch your own life. And I think that as the economic reality becomes more stark here, the more we want to see rich people do stuff. And the word aspirational has been in my life and my career since the day I started. It's always a little aspirational.
Yeah.
And I think I think in a time when there was an actual, viable middle class in this country, it was maybe more interesting to look at working class people. And now it's scarier, I would say, because it's the reality for a lot of us.
Yeah. Awesome. Thank you.
Thanks, Anna.
Daniela, do you have a question?
Yes, I mean, it's a little bit terrifying to me to ask about contemporary television, but one of the things that has been super interesting for me about this conversation and about how you were framing this history is the blurb at the back of your book talks about liberal heterosexual white America. And the American studies, the US context in which this conversation has happened has been really fascinating to me as an immigrant and somebody who grew up watching US television in Latin America, and where there were basically two genres, right? One was Hispanophone television that was national, but also international, but produced in certain genres in Spanish telenovelas, and everything else was US dubbed television. So it was all one single thing from the US, and it was all dubbed by the same voice actors, so everybody had the same voices, right? So it had these very specific associations, but you could never identify with it. That was not the point. The point was that it was ethnographic, that it was sort of vicarious, virtual exploring of these weird places and people that were all American. And that's what was so weird. And one of the things that strikes me as very different in the 40 years that you trace is that US television has become much more internationalized through access to television produced in other cultures and in other languages. And so I was just curious how this sort of globalizes or internationalizes for you, and whether sort of the Venn diagrams or the taxonomies become different once you think of all of this as US television, right? Like this mega category where the distinctions that are so keenly felt within such a, huge demographic and diverse demographic as the US become collapsed for people outside the US who are watching this, or immigrants in the US who are watching this. And, there was this question of like, is this white television? Is gringo television, right? So like, what happens when US television becomes not only US?
Well, thank you so much for that question, Daniela. I mean, this is very much an American project, right? It's very much about the American imaginary and around like what remains of that. And in not only that, but it's like this is about network television, right? So this book is about shows that appear, with the exception of the True Blood Funhouse Mirror on premium cable. This is all stuff that ostensibly you can still access on network TV, and that addresses the big monoculture, right? That said, of course, that has viewing practice, television, period. When one talks to our students at USC, like for the last decade, nobody watches it anymore, right? Or people of that age really don't tend to watch television in the way we imagine television being watched. And it's often like in a kind of transmedia, conglomeration of different things, right? So this is very much about thinking through the project of normativity, and TV is a kind of the normativizing agent of US culture on its way out, right? Like as a kind of it's sort of its last, swan song, its dying gasp. That's why we sort of finish with a show like This Is Us, where it's like, that's the end of Normporn. Like this isn't working, and like these things have to seep in. There has to be the structure cannot absorb the national structure, the genre, the medium can't absorb these things anymore. So yeah, very much like it is an end of American empire book, and it's about the death of this, or maybe not the death of this medium, but the sort of the way this medium is receding into other things that defines that. Because for sure, the presence of international television and other, being able to subscribe just to BritBox, right? It means that you can you can kind of just let yourself have a very niche and the hyper narrowcast viewing experience. But narrow casting is a thing that began in the 90s, essentially, or late 80s, early 90s, right? So that's also part of why I say in the 1990s in particular, as narrow casting was finding its footing, we sort of don't see any big shows emerging from that period that fits this bill.
We have one question in the chat from Amelia Jones. How do you account for highly normative shows about queers, gays, and lesbians, like Queer Eye, or isn't class in some ways the determinant issue on these?
I would say that those shows aren't normative representations of gay people. I don't think those are new normal representations of gay people. I think what they are is shows that domesticate gays for the larger viewing public, right? So depicting the L word, like the original L word, is melodrama, it's soap. There's people getting it on poolside, doing whatever, women having sex in the bathroom at the Planet or what have you. That's not normative activity. But what it is, it's in the way that television domesticates different views of people, right? For a viewing public. That's, I think, what that's doing. And the same with Queer Eye. Queer Eye, not only just as a reality series, but it has, as a cultural phenomenon, is responsible for domesticating the very word queer itself, right? And making people think that, okay, queer is a word that just seems harmless and descriptive, as opposed to something with the same powerful political force. What the new Queer Eye tries to do is to make some sort of interventionist claim on behalf of, queers being the ambassadors cutting across race, class, and geographical strife in the United States, particularly because they've been shooting in red states, et cetera, and showing that there can be contact, connection, and transformation enacted together. So that's a different project, whatever that is. So that's sort of what I would say about how those shows are functioning. The normative is not really even operative there. It's not even the homonormative is very operative there. It's it's a different project. It's like queer in its quote unquote domesticated format. Even the things that seem edgy, like the non-binary JVN, you know, it's just like, oh, aren't they adorable? Aren't they just the best? They're so fun. I love them, you know? Anyway, I hope that makes sense.
There's one last question sneaking in at the last second, as always happens, but I think you could get it in a minute, right? Can you talk to us about whether you see a relationship between norm porn and online cultures like cottagecore that you know, kind of congregate on spaces like YouTube?
I feel like Jane Hughes should answer this question on my behalf, but absolutely. I mean, I think that for sure, like there is a shared affective, political, and aesthetic sensibility around, say, norm porn, the fashion trend of norm core, and what you get as cottagecore, trad this, trad that. I think there is, like, you know, there is an aesthetic, like there are certain aesthetic sensibilities and overlaps that, of course, you can't extract aesthetics from politics, so they're resonant in that political sphere and field, right? So yeah, Jane says cottagecore is related to BritBox too. But yeah, like that, but it is like this sort of, there is an attachment to, maybe it's a little bit different because it's an attachment to a certain kind of, like, to a more overt attachment to tradition than, say, norm porn, which is like an attachment to a new normalcy, like, you know, something transformed by a more enlightened generation, as opposed to like a throwback to, you know, the time we churned butter and, like, you know, it was like traditional gender roles were in place. I hope that makes sense. I don't know.
I think I mean, I can't imagine what a better place to stop that butter churning for this conversation. We are sadly at time, so I have to bring it to a close. My thanks to everyone who came, and especially everyone who asked questions, to Scott Poulson-Bryant and Sarah Gertrude Shapiro for joining us, for your time, your expertise in this conversation with Karen. Tara, as always, an amazing moderator, although today it was hard to get a word in edgewise, even for Tara. And above all, thank you, Karen, for your book and for telling us all about it, and many congratulations. I just wanted very quickly to mention the next of our 11 book chats. We do as many as we can to celebrate new books by USC authors. The next one is on April 17, where we will discuss Wolf Brunner's Resistors, How Ordinary Jews Fought Persecution in Hitler's Germany, out last year. Thank you all, and Karen, again, many congratulations.
Thank you all. Take care.